you first move into a new place, one of the first things you do is get some internet installed. The internet guy comes over, spends an hour or two, and now you have this box in your closet that lets you get away from the world and into the real world, the internet, where you can find weirdos like this guy who's about to talk about home networking for over 20 minutes. If you think about it, all your devices that are connected to your internet are all meeting at this little box, and you can do a lot with just that. But once you start looking into this, the rabbit hole gets pretty deep. So I'm here to talk about everything that I've learned about home networking from someone who didn't know much about it until I finally left my parents' place. Let's start. First off, why would someone spend money and get into home networking? We live in a pretty wireless world. Your phone connects to cell towers wirelessly, your headphones connect to your phone over Bluetooth wirelessly, and your laptop connects to the internet through your router wirelessly. But because of this, there are lots of signals bouncing around your home at any given time. Now, I'm not a tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist, but just imagine a home full of invisible people yelling at each other throughout the house. One, that would be really creepy, and you may be hearing voices. Do get that checked out by a doctor. And two, the more voices that get added, the harder it would be to hear what the person you're listening to is actually saying. Between all the different devices that someone owns, there's just so much talking and yapping between them that we just don't see it. And home networking helps us better manage all of those different conversations that are happening between them and make the conversation smoother, more reliable, and hopefully faster. How I personally view home networking at its core is focusing on the management of these devices that live within your home and how they communicate in your local area network, or LAN. For most people, before going down the home networking rabbit hole, this is just your Wi-Fi network that all your stuff is connected to, or whatever else you have connected to your router. So let's break it down. What you need all boils down to what you plan to do with your home network. If all you want to do is connect to your stuff through Wi-Fi, or plug in a few smart home hubs, or a mesh Wi-Fi network into your router and just call it a day, a simple setup would be fine. Basically, your needs aren't much, and that's perfect. The simpler the better. But then, like, what if you want to run security cameras and view it from your phone? What if you want to run a media server with all of your saved up movies? What if you're a gamer who wants the absolute best and quickest connection possible? What if you're a YouTuber who edits YouTube videos from home, who never gets to go outside and touch grass, but needs faster storage that you can access from any part of the home? Well, that's where we have to get more complex. So to make things easy on myself, I'm gonna use myself as an example because I'm probably trying to do a lot of what you're probably thinking of already. I wanna set up my home network to handle a lot of different things. I want to limit the devices floating around on Wi-Fi. I'm gonna use Ethernet as much as possible. I also want a super fast connection so that I'm able to edit my YouTube videos off of a network drive, which is kind of like a Google Drive, but on steroids. I want a home media server so that I'm able to watch my content. And then I wanna make sure all my smart home products work together. And I also want to install cameras so I have visibility as to what's happening around my home, especially when I'm away from it. So now that we have all of the goals that we're trying to accomplish, all of the things I've listed out here helps me understand the type of things that I need to accomplish these goals. But just keep in mind that some of these I've already talked about in a lot of detail in other videos. And this video is long enough as is, so I'll just link them wherever they're supposed to go up here. But those things are still super important to this video because everything I'm about to talk about is really what enables those videos and those projects to work out the way that they have. All right, so let's talk about the basics. There are two devices that give you the internet, and these are usually provided by your ISP, your modem and your router. Or if you have AT&T fiber like me, you have a 2-in-1 device like this that does both. Your modem takes the internet signal from your coaxial or fiber internet connection and puts it in a form your devices use, like translating languages. Your router is the device that has a Wi-Fi access point that actually emits the Wi-Fi signal for the rest of your devices to connect to. And it typically also has ports on the back that you can plug wired devices into. For most people, this is it. This is their entire home network. All their stuff connects through Wi-Fi through their router, and any smart home hubs that they own, like those Philips Hue hubs, are plugged directly into this thing, and then they call it a day. Basically, anything that wants access to the internet has to connect to this box, wired or wirelessly. And for a lot of people, that works perfectly fine. But if you want to make it more robust and add things to it, that's when we really have to talk about things like switches. No, we're not talking about these type of switches, or even these kind of switches. What I'm talking about are network switches. These are little boxes with a bunch of Ethernet ports that lets you connect more devices physically. The router your internet provider gave you probably already has a switch built in, and you can use those to connect your devices. Ethernet switches are basically like a power strip, where from one plug you can connect multiple items, but with data instead of electricity. Unlike a power strip where power goes from the wall to the strip, the data can go in and out of each end, back and forth. If in your household, you're the designated installer of stuff, and by that, I mean the person that your friends or family asked to set up their new laptop, TV, or smart home stuff, then you've probably already seen and know about the Ethernet ports on those devices. Then you probably were already smart enough to put 2 and 2 together and connect your devices directly to your internet router or to switches that sit between your router and that device, giving them faster and stable access to the internet. And that's what makes Ethernet so great. It provides a reliable, fast connection without fiddling with Wi-Fi passwords. That being said, switches come in all kinds of different sizes, specs, and speed. So you gotta know what you're buying and make sure it suits your specific needs. To briefly break it down, there are 2 primary types of switches you should be thinking of: unmanaged and managed switches. Unmanaged switches are basically dumb switches. You plug some cables into them and they just route data to the rest of the ports. These would be your bog standard, typical cheapo $20 switches, but are $15 if you check the little box that saves you $5. But that could create some issues too if you decide to go that route. Like if you decide to loop your switches together in a circle. Because you might think, hey, if a cable fails, at least there's still a connection between this switch and the other switch to get to the third switch. This is a huge no-no when it comes to unmanaged switches. Do not do this. Your network will suffer because of it. Managed switches give you a lot more control over all of your connected devices. Every managed switch has different capabilities, but some of the features include the ability to limit the speed of certain ports, see how much activity is occurring on each one, prevent loops through STP, and the ability to configure VLANs or virtual local area networks on your device. VLANs would be like making different pathways for your devices to interact with each other on the same device so that it's more efficient and separates your stuff from each other so that they don't interact. It's kind of like in a train station, there's multiple trains and they're all going to different locations. As long as you're on the right platform, everything is going into that train station, but there's different routes out. I don't know if that was a good analogy, but you tell me. With support for multiple VLANs, I can set a dedicated VLAN to just my smart home stuff, one for all my YouTube devices, one dedicated for guests' Wi-Fi access, and the last one for everything else. It's nice that everything isn't under a single umbrella, and I don't need a whole nother set of switches to do all of that physically separately. All right, awesome. That was easy. So you're good, right? Just plug in your devices into the switch connected to your router and just call it a day. But then the biggest issue shows its ugly head. Your router may be in a completely different room than where you want to plug things into. Like the router is in the closet, but the PS5 is in the flex room. How can you connect those 2 devices so that you can game with a stable internet connection on your PS5? Well, that depends on where and how you live. If your place has Ethernet jacks on the wall in different rooms, there's most likely a patch panel somewhere in your place where all these lead to, with each cable properly labeled. That would be the most ideal location to connect everything together through a switch. And sometimes life works great that way. You'll get everything done in an afternoon. You put a switch in and plug in all your cables and you're good to go. But let's be honest here. That's probably not what you're dealing with. But instead, what you're more likely to find are old phone jacks, which kind of look like slightly smaller Ethernet jacks, or coaxial, which is what you'd use for cable or satellite TV. This is more common in older homes and apartments and complicates things because if you rent, I don't think your landlord or management would appreciate you making holes and installing wires through the walls of the property. If you own your own place, you can install Ethernet yourself if you're DIY savvy enough, but for me personally, I worked with an electrician who was familiar with Ethernet drops to install additional Ethernet drops in the places that I needed. Okay, I'll have to talk to a very small subset of people watching here, but if you are building a house or are in the process of building a house, consider getting the drops installed during that process instead of after. So I live in a relatively new home and we got to pick a lot of the finishes with our home builder. The cost of each drop was only like $40 with them compared to some of the quotes that I was getting after the home was built, which were much more expensive. The builder even let me decide where to put the patch panel where all the cables terminated to. Regardless, if you own or rent a property, if running Ethernet cables and drilling holes in your wall isn't feasible, you do have a few options. The first would be to just run Ethernet cable throughout your home along the walls. It's ugly and potentially a tripping hazard if not contained, but It works. Then there's Mocha network adapters, which can take your Ethernet cable, convert it to coaxial, and use the coaxial cable in your walls to deliver data to another room with coaxial and another Mocha network adapter to convert it back to Ethernet. I personally haven't tried this method since, like I said, I have Ethernet built in, but it's a great option to consider and something that you should probably dig deeper yourself if you need it. And lastly, there's power line adapters, which use a standard outlet's wiring for electricity to also send data signals throughout that wire. You plug one of these in where your router is and the other where you plan to plug your device in, and then just plug Ethernet cables in. But do know that through this method, expect slower speeds than if you wired it through Mocha or directly through Ethernet. For my own setup, I have all my cables routed to the patch panel in my hallway closet. From here, I have a central location for all my networking that everything in the house connects to. All right, based on everything that I brought up so far, making the perfect home networking setup for yourself is gonna be a really long process. But another thing to consider is, during scenarios like a power outage, how can you make sure that your network works when you need it most? Well, that's where today's sponsor, BLUETTI, and their AC180 comes into play. The BLUETTI AC180 is a portable power station that has a large 1,152 watt-hour lithium iron phosphate 4 battery, which means this thing is durable enough to charge over 3,500 battery cycles. Individual pieces of networking equipment doesn't really sip crazy power by themselves, but with a bunch of gear, it can pull a decent amount of power, and the AC180 is able to power all of it for hours before shutting down. I live in Houston, Texas, and we get a lot of storms during the summer that have the potential to knock out power during unpredictable weather. Having a portable power station ensures that I can power my necessities and even my networking gear for access to the internet, and even if you don't decide to use it to be the ultimate battery backup for your home networking stuff, the BLUETTI AC180 is an amazing power station that can be used for camping in the great outdoors. With up to 1,800 watts of continuous AC power, you can power up power-hungry appliances like electric grills, rice cookers, and air fryers. I'm actually planning a camping trip this fall, and this is one item that I 100% plan to bring with me. The BLUETTI AC180 is also watt for watt, less expensive than many competitors, and has a 5-year warranty for some peace of mind. And this thing can go from 0 to 100 using a standard wall outlet in about an hour. So I ran a quick little experiment. I wanted to see if my home network and NAS could be run off of this and for how long. And it lasted a whole 5.5 hours, which is awesome considering it was powering a UPS, 3 network switches, my router, a NAS, access points, and security cameras. The AC180 also has app support that lets you see the wattage you're using, and even has cool functions like powerlifting mode, which can increase the wattage depending on your personal needs. So if you're interested in the BLUETTI AC180 to use as a backup UPS for your server, or as a nice camping companion, check out the link in the video description below. Anyway, back to more home networking stuff. Okay, so let's just say that you have all your cabling and routing sorted out. Now what? From here, it depends on what you want to do. This will affect what you actually need and the performance required out of your hardware. So let's look at my own scenario. A couple of these stand out to me because they require more unique hardware than just a managed network switch. So let's delve deeper into these, starting with the tried and true Ethernet cable. Ethernet cables are the wires that will be the pipeline between your data, between all of your different wired devices. To get the most out of your cables, I highly suggest getting Cat 6 or Cat 6A cables for residential properties, because these will give you up to 10 gigabits per second of bandwidth. There's 8 gigabits in a gigabyte, so the 10 gigabit you get out of the cables would be a maximum potential output of 1,250 megabytes per second, which is about as fast as you'd get from one of these snazzy SSDs right now. So how do we unlock that speed? Well, it's all up to your network switch or your devices to determine how much they can take. Typically, most devices you own will have gigabit Ethernet ports built in. For most tasks, that's fine. Your internet most likely caps out at gigabit speeds anyway, so gigabit connections will handle the vast majority of people's use cases. But if you're trying to be more intense and know you'll be moving a lot of data through these Ethernet pipes, like editing 4K YouTube videos, backing up large amounts of data, or running a personal media server with lots of 4K content that you plan to watch throughout the home, that's when you want like 2.5 or 10 gigabit Ethernet switches. But like all things that are better or faster, expect to pay more for the speed, like a lot more. Once you start trying to connect things through Ethernet, you'll notice that your cables are getting messier and messier because you had a power cable and now an Ethernet cable coming out of your devices. But an amazing feature that you might get on an Ethernet switch and other devices is power over Ethernet. Power over Ethernet ports on certain switches can power your devices over Ethernet without the need for a power cable, aka a lot less cables to deal with. PoE comes in a few flavors that just outlines how much more juice it can push between PoE, PoE Plus, and PoE++. Basically, more plus signs mean more power. So this feature doesn't work on just random devices with Ethernet ports though, but just devices that have Ethernet ports that support it. So no, you won't be powering your TV through this, and definitely not your PS5. But PoE is usually used for powering additional network switches, Wi-Fi access points, and security cameras that are labeled to be powered by Ethernet. This feature is usually integrated on devices where getting power alongside the Ethernet would be difficult. So like the access point scenario, you don't want to have to install another outlet alongside your access point, right? When you're building something out. It's nice that all you need is just one cable that powers it. That's pretty easy to get through the wall. I yapped enough about network switches and Ethernet ports by this point. We're pretty far into this video now. So let's get to the more exciting part. What am I actually using for my own home network? For the longest time, I thought I could get away with just a simple network, my router and a switch connected to it. But the more techie and more tinkering that I wanted to do to my home network, the more I realized I needed something more. So everything that I'm about to say for myself definitely goes more prosumer or power user rather than your average everyday person. So be warned, I bought a Ubiquiti UDM Pro Special Edition, which is basically a rack-mountable switch that controls a ton of Ubiquiti's own line of products, from additional network switches, access points, cameras, and applications. It's their gateway into their ecosystem. But this didn't satisfy my desire for security cameras or high transfer speed for my YouTube activities. That's when some friends over at Ubiquiti sent some cool stuff over. Full disclosure here, Ubiquiti stuff is in the prosumer level and does get pretty expensive, but I wanted to be 100% transparent here. Some of the things I'm using in this setup was sent over to me by Ubiquiti, but I want to make this absolutely clear. I had already purchased a ton of Ubiquiti gear myself and was already using it for some time, well before they reached out to me. So while it was very nice of them to send me some stuff, and I am an active user of their products, I just wanted to make sure everyone who's watching is aware that some things were sent to me and that there are other viable alternatives out there as well. But for me, I like Ubiquiti's stuff, and so that's why I'm personally using them here. Ubiquiti sent over a Pro Max 24 PoE, which has a ton of 2.5 gigabit per second PoE++ ports, and an Enterprise XG24, which has, hear me out, 24 10 gigabit per second ports. Both these switches came with more ports than I know what to do with, but it does give me room for future expandability, like if I ever move into a larger home and need to add more cameras, access points, or Ethernet to more rooms. So these three main devices are the backbone of my home network and YouTube setup, and basically everything in my house gets plugged into these three things. So as you can imagine, with this much networking equipment and this many ports, cables probably get pretty messy. So this is an area that you'd want to clean up. The first thing to consider when cleaning this mess up is a server rack, which is basically what keeps rack-mountable switches organized and compact. I'm using the Ubiquiti toolless mini rack to hold all these switches in one place, and then using a patch panel. A patch panel organizes all of your incoming Ethernet cables so that you can easily and neatly swap connections if needed. This one is specifically designed for this toolless mini rack, but I will say that the toolless mini rack works best with Ubiquiti gear. And if you do plan to mix and match switches from different brands, consider a different rack because you'll have more size options and better compatibility. From here, if you just use any random Ethernet cable to connect all your stuff, you're gonna have a bad time. This is when you'd want patch cables. Patch cables are very short Ethernet cables that don't have a ton of cable slack. This cuts down how much cabling gets in the way if you decide to change out any of your connections. And seriously, they clean up your networking gear so nice. So after all of my cleaning up, this is how my server rack looks. My AT&T router modem thing is plugged into the UDM Pro SE, which controls all of my Ubiquiti applications and internet connection. Any device that needs power over Ethernet is plugged directly into the Pro Max 24 PoE, and anything that needs a super fast 10 gigabit per second connection is plugged into the Enterprise XG24. And lastly, I put a UPS on top for backup power. However, rack mount UPSs like this one isn't necessarily for making sure all of your stuff stays on for a long period of time. They're more so for you to be able to turn off all your devices safely during a power outage. If you want more continuous power during a power outage, that's when you'd look at more things like today's earlier sponsor, the BLUETTI AC180. Each of these switches serve a different purpose, but how do these things work together to form a cohesive system? Well, you can connect switches together so that they talk to each other. These specific switches have these SFP ports for faster data transfers between them. So you can just get SFP plus cables and just plug them into each other. But something to consider when you're connecting different switches together is that, like the example earlier, you don't want them in a circle. You want them like a branching tree, with your main switch, then your secondary switch, then whatever remaining switches. Unlike power strips, which you shouldn't be plugging into a chain unless you got a thing for accidental arson, network switches can be chained together, but at the same time, the further in the chain, the higher likelihood that it would be unstable. So while being 3 to 4 switches deep is fine, being 8 to 10 switches in could explain some of the issues that you're getting. So for the most stable results, limit it where you can. So for me, this means that my internet router is connected directly to the UDM Pro, then the Pro Max and Enterprise switches are connected to the UDM Pro. From there, each room is equipped with their own switch to do whatever function that room serves. So in the living room, I have a basic gigabit switch for my different smart home stuff, TV and Apple TV. In the bedrooms, I keep a PoE Flex mini switch so that I can keep TVs and streaming devices connected. These little guys are tiny, manageable switches and are powered by Ethernet and provide quite a few ports for a basic setup. Then to make sure I have high-speed 10 gigabit Ethernet connections for YouTube videos, I have this Ubiquiti Flex 10 gigabit Ethernet switch. This gives me additional 10 gigabit ports in the spaces that might need it the most for additional computers or for NASs. Okay, but that only solves my wired problem. What about Wi-Fi? The thing my significant other and guests will complain about if it's not working right. So I kind of went a little overkill here because if I want to upgrade my stuff in the future, I want it to be as easy as possible. This requires talking about my attic. I bought these Ubiquiti Flex switches because they're powered over Ethernet and have PoE pass-through ports that I can use for access points and security cameras. These things aren't standard switches. These are made to handle more rugged environments, and so I slapped 2 of them in my hot Texas attic, with one towards the front and the other one towards the back of the house for 2 different zones. This way, if I want to install additional cameras or access points, I don't have to run new Ethernet lines down into the patch box into my closet every single time I want to install something new into my network. And I don't even need additional power because that Flex switch provides additional PoE ports that can then power these new access points or these new cameras. Okay, so I'm not gonna talk about my security camera setup too much in this video. That's more so for a second video, so be on the lookout for that. But we can talk more about my access point situation. From the attic, I had Ethernet dropped into the ceiling in the front and back of the house for these UniFi 7 Pro and UniFi 7 Pro Max access points that are routed directly to my network closet. Because these are powered over Ethernet and have speeds of up to 2.5 gigabits per second, I wanted to route these directly to my server rack instead of to those Flex switches I have in the attic to maximize their performance. With these overkill access points, I'm able to do some video editing over Wi-Fi. But for most people, a 1 gigabit connection would be perfectly fine. When you have a lot of Wi-Fi connected devices in your home, they can bog down your access point, and when your house is wide or long, a single access point might not give you enough Wi-Fi coverage for your entire home. But we can improve both of those issues by having multiple access points in the home. Since my house is rectangular shaped, it made sense to have an access point in the front and one in the back of the house for maximum coverage. Access points are wired directly to the source through Ethernet. So yeah, that's my home networking setup, but I wanted to touch on something lightly before I end this long video. A lot of people will have a robust network like this for all the reasons I mentioned throughout this video, including the ones I wrote earlier on these sticky notes. But they'll also run applications beyond that through Docker containers on a computer connected to their network and a NAS. Docker containers house applications that can be used by your devices on the home network, like Home Assistant, which is a smart home platform that consolidates all of your other smart home platforms together under one umbrella. Plex, where you can create a streaming content library based on your own media, or AdGuard to block ads at the network level so that you don't see any on any connected devices. There's a lot of cool stuff out there that you can do with your home network, and way more than I can fit in this short video. Other times, someone could use a NAS to do all of this. A NAS is basically a computer that's purpose-built for storing data and making it available on the network. Some pre-built options include Synology and QNAP, and these systems are like Google Drive but on steroids. With as much storage as you can think of, depending on how much you're willing to pay. And while they're built to be a giant hard drive basically, they're still computers. So people like to keep Docker containers on their NAS to get those additional network features and still have all their storage on one device. It's a good combo and one that I personally use too. All right, so with all that being said, after learning all of this and setting it up for myself, how is my own networking setup doing? It's been a few weeks after I've got it fully up and running, and it's been holding up great. I'm getting the speed and performance I'm expecting from all the places I have home networking set up, and when something is down or not behaving correctly, it's reported to me on the UniFi app since most of my networking gear is from Ubiquiti. I'm able to manage my home network from my phone and do pulse checks on it. The 10 gigabit connections really helped me with my video editing workflow, and having so many available ports means that I can just adjust my needs quickly instead of patching together a string of random smaller switches like I used to do a year or two ago when I was more naive. With 2 APs, all the Wi-Fi problems I used to get at the edges of the home are completely gone, and I even got decent internet from my front and backyard now. I now rarely see an issue with Wi-Fi or Ethernet speed, except for when the power is out. I think the project ended up a complete success. At the same time, I hope everything that I learned throughout this is also helpful for your own home networking journey, whatever the goal is. Whether it's simple as plugging in another unmanaged switch to your router, or just building out a robust home network, I hope it goes well. What do you personally think? Was everything that I mentioned in this video helpful? How's your own home networking journey going? I hope I simplified it enough for you. There's a lot of information out there, and it can get super overwhelming. If you already know enough about home networking, were there any areas you thought I could improve? Let me know in the comment section below, and if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, and well, I'll see you all next time. Bye.